Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. Steve, welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about community organizing and really making the changes to protect the land that was your backyard.
Thanks. Happy to start remembering.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is always interesting to me is sort of thinking back and setting the stage to the time that this all was happening. This was about 2000, and I'd love you just to sort of set up like what was going on, what was happening, just globally, nationally, and then, what did you start doing to make these changes?
It's amazing when we think about how fast time goes, but yet how different we are today. 2000, we had just survived turning from 1999 to 2000, where there were so many predictions that systems were going to crash, that all this unbelievable
Y2K.
things, and we came right through it without without a glitch.
Nothing
that I
happened,
remembered,
right?
And so that's sort of where we were. When we think about the environmental picture, the first LEED building hadn't been certified. There were some voices around the world about this, but there was not any real efforts from general population really being concerned about it like we are today. It's in the press all the time.
Yeah.
Back then, it was an occasional story if Prince Charles or Al Gore or Paul Hawken had mentioned something. And then Ray Anderson was a voice, but the voices were few. And it was a different world. I think our general listeners can think about the fact that we didn't have iPhones. and that's, that shows you something that we just take for granted as part of our life. It was the same thing with all the environmental conversation just was not present.
Yeah. Well, and I think Quinn, who works with me, your daughter, your youngest, still drives a Prius that I think you guys bought around that time period.
That's right. We had signed up to be one of the early purchasers, and I believe Georgia got 6 of them.
What?
And it was Ted Turner. It was, I think, Jane Fonda, Ray Anderson, us, and I didn't recognize the names of the other 2 people. But you just sort of, it was just a thing. I never thought much about it until here a couple of years ago. One of the young technicians in the service place opened the door and said, "Wow." And I had never realized that they were numbered, and he actually could see the number.
Okay.
And we were in the nation something like 426 or 20 something.
Nice.
And he just like, whoa, that was amazing.
That's pretty cool. So environmentalism or sustainability was still sort of this thing over in the corner, wasn't sort of present day, and obviously increasingly important to our lives. And so when you knew you were going to build this place that was eventually going to be called Serenbe, what kind of rules or what kind of things did you need to do to change? Like, where do you start there?
Well, a number of things. Number one, it just seemed natural that we would be doing an environmental, and I'm not sure that we put tags on it. It's sort of like it reminds me when I hired an organic gardener, and by the end of the interview, I said, "Well, we do practice organic gardening," and she said, "I have no idea what that is."
What?
And then I talked a little more to explain to her. She said, "Oh, well, that's the way my grandmother taught me." So it's the label sometimes we put on that. So when we thought about building a community, we didn't necessarily think about building an environmental community. We thought about building a responsibly developed community.
Right.
So I think it's interesting, the play of the words and how we have to label everything today to be clear. But being naive as a developer, because I had never actually developed real estate. I had developed restaurants within real estate projects, but I did not realize how much of what we needed to do or wanted to do to be responsible was actually not permitted or illegal in some cases. The first realization as I visited other places who had cutting edge things, whether it's years ago, Davis in California.
Yep.
If you look at Seaside in Florida, Prairie Crossing outside Chicago, they all had cutting edge ideas that people responded to. But in looking at what happened after they became known, the neighboring landowners did not share the same practices. This was especially evident to me when we visited the Rainies of Prairie Crossing, and they shared the heartache that they thought they were going to be the example for that section of sprawling Chicago.
Right.
And they actually accelerated the deterioration of the area as far as development, because they saved 70% of their land, and I saw how you could do that.
Right.
But then everyone who came in next to them did not save any land. They simply snuggled as close as they could to the saved land at Prairie Crossing so they could take advantage of it without actually participating.
Right. So they became a magnet.
And so it was a little bit of urban sprawl right next to their preserved model. Seaside, we started going to Seaside when the girls were small in the 80s. And so we saw that as this wonderful little beach village with the sand dunes on each side. And you visit Seaside today, and it is one development along a string of developments. Right. And you have to look carefully at the landscaping to know when you've entered one and left the last one.
Yeah.
And so I knew that if we were going to do something as a responsible model on our land, we had to figure out a way that we didn't actually accelerate the destruction of this greater area southwest of Atlanta.
And that was where you kind of saw the 70-30 rule, where if you can take acreage and if you can protect 70% and build on the other 30, sort of Prairie Crossing was one of those places that did it. I know you've mentioned Boulder and...
Well, the big thing I realized as I thought about it was that we had to bring the larger community in, that this wasn't something that was something I could do on my land to change it, or I would be an island. And so the first conversation began with two large landowners who had more property than we did in this general area. We invited them to dinner.
Okay.
Marie was a great cook, and we had several cases of wine, and so everyone accepted. And of course, large landowners were pro-development. That's why you held large land holdings. It would be eventually to develop. And this was a complete new idea that I was suggesting. And I wasn't really suggesting a specific idea, only that how could we save a portion of this land without totally asphalting it over? And of course, the southwest part of Atlanta was not in the highly desired area in 2000, so people were willing to talk like this. Luckily, both landowners were European heritage or connections. And so they really understood. I didn't have to create a new language. They understood when I was talking about density and villages and hamlets. They just didn't think it would fly in America, and the market was there.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so they said, well, why not? Let's try it. So I felt that, wow, I had my speaking points together, and I was ready. And I remember another thing that happened in 2000 is Excel had been released somewhere in the near future. At least I was a brand new user.
The Excel spreadsheet?
Excel spreadsheet. And so
I was like, what?
The county has announced that you could download the tax records now for the first time.
Oh.
And so I downloaded the tax records on an Excel spreadsheet and practiced sorting landowners to see who had the largest land holdings. And I wanted to gather those who owned the largest parcels in this area. Looking at zoning maps, there was 40,000 acres in the southern tip of Fulton County that was still agriculturally zoned without any interruptions from any of the neighboring cities, and they just had not been expanding.
Okay.
And so I realized that was my target, is who owned land in that 40,000 acres. And if I could sit down with the ownership of 51%, then I could create a consensus of who these people were. And if they were agreeable, I could be a spokesperson as I move forward to the county government as to what we wanted to do.
Smart.
And so I was excited about how convincing I was, and we sent an invitation, and being hospitality people, we had a great dessert spread, and 32 of the 36 showed up.
Oh, wow.
And it was anyone who owned 180 acres or more. Now, this was a collection of folks who had inherited land for generations. It was land speculators and people like us who had found this rural paradise so close to the city.
Sure.
Yeah, from the professional fields in Atlanta. And about 90 minutes into the meeting, I called it off because it reminded me of the worst zoning sessions I had ever sat through. And the very animated conversations were the inherited landowners. Half wanted to save this area so that their grandchildren could enjoy it as they had. And the other half were expecting payday. Bring on the bulldozers, how else are we going to get the money?
Yeah.
And so they had no problems calling each other names across the room. They'd grown up together.
Oh, no.
And we were getting nowhere. And so I called that off. And I realized I needed more research. I needed a more convincing story.
Okay.
And fortunately, at the time, the Urban Land Institute doing some studies, because in the 80s and 90s, we were building golf courses everywhere. We had an incredible number, and the financial community loved them because they saw the premiums that these lots were bringing. And so they were willing to fund developers if they were putting golf courses in.
Okay.
And so we were really feasting on this one particular development pattern for upper end housing in America. And so the Urban Land Institute conducted a study to understand this. And they understood that the financial community liked it. But to their surprise, they found that 92% of the people who owned the lots, the people who paid those premiums, played golf twice or less a year.
Wow. So
that was the realization that these people were paying this for the open space, and it had nothing to do with golf courses. And so that really gave me the information I needed, because in this pro-development, pro-preservation group, it really did not have a lot to do for the pro-development group. It wasn't about development. It was about value of their land.
Right.
And if I could say we had a better value on the land as a whole, if we saved 70% while developing 30%, using the model, the ratio that I saw at Prairie Crossing, is where I got my 30-70, I saw it could be done, that we could actually answer the value question while preserving 70% for the preservation community.
Interesting, and satisfy both sides.
So I thought, this is great for these large landowners. This is a good this is a good way to bring the two together.
Okay.
And so I thought, no, I just have to get them back in this room.
Right.
Because the meeting did not end well. And I knew I had one of the big voices who was a property rights person. Okay. A man in his 80s who's since deceased. And I called Mr. Thompson. I said, I've got some more information. Would you come back one more time? And he said, nobody's going to tell me what to do with my land, son. And I was glad that he called me son. I was in my 50s, but now I know that's just perspective, no matter where you sit. And I said, well, Mr. Thompson, if someone builds a housing development across the road from you when they sell it, you've just given away your property rights by staying silent. And I'm inviting you to participate in a conversation to maintain your property rights so that you have a say-so on what's going on. And he thought about that for a minute, and he said, "Are you going to have peach cobbler?" I said, "Absolutely." The third person I talked to wanted to know if we were going to have the bourbon pecan pie. I said, "Absolutely." So Marie kept baking. I kept calling meetings. And we gradually got a consensus between the pro-development, pro-preservation groups. But that was only the first leg. These were my large landowners.
Right.
This was 36 people out of over 500 landowners.
36 out of 500.
And so I realized that if we had a consensus with the large landowners, that would breed suspicion from the other landowners. Just kind of where we are in America today. If one group thinks it's good and they're not part of your group, you must think it's something wrong with you.
I know.
So with that, and I realized there were 500 people that owned anywhere from a half an acre up to the 179 acres. And so we divided them into 6 groups. I asked 6 different people if they would be team leaders.
Okay.
And we divided them into these groups according to the amount of acres that they owned.
Okay.
And we started coffees in people's homes, in the churches, community rooms. The team leaders always had to have fresh baked goods. And I came with a PowerPoint, and we talked about the issues, not the solutions, just the issues.
Right.
And we asked them if they wanted to be empowered to decide what our future was versus wait for a developer to decide what they wanted to do.
Right.
And then we realized that there was interest, and we then received a grant from the Fulton County Economic Development in partnership with the Nature Conservancy.
Oh, okay.
So as we move forward, it was always with that balance of preservation and development moving forward. With that grant, we placed an RFP out for a design group to lead a public effort. ECOS was the small local group that we awarded that contract to and started planning public process. About this time, our county commissioner called me and said, "Steve, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, Commissioner, we've got some great ideas." And he said, He said, the north end of the county, now, people that are not aware, Atlanta is in the middle of Fulton County, and Fulton County's 80 miles long.
Right.
So people refer to it many times as the north end and the south end of the county. And most of the development pressure has been in the north end. And so he said, a few months ago, he said all those people up north had a great idea that sounds a lot like what you're suggesting. And by the time they got to the county commission chambers for a vote on their ideas, there were 200 people with ball caps for and 200 with T-shirts against.
Oh.
Please don't set me up to where I have to vote against half of my constituents. So I thought about that a minute, and I said, "Well, Commissioner, if you'll give me your full support, I won't bring it before you if we have perceived more than 30% opposition." Now, where I got that number, I don't know. It came out to get his support. We shook hands on that, and so to secure what our support was, we created the Chattahoochee Hill Country Alliance.
Okay.
It was $2 an acre to belong. And this would be the organization that would then fund some of the ideas that this was the organization that the grants came through, and it was the various property owners came. It was an actual organization. I was the founding chair, and with that agreement, the commissioner gave me the complete support of the planning department.
Okay. Oh, that's great.
And his personal support as we move through this. So we then started our meetings that were public meetings. And there's a wonderful story in absolutely every one of those stories. For the first meeting, we sent out a postcard to invite people to the first public discussion. And at the time, Carlton Road on the edge of Palmetto, which had been a forest that we all drove through, had just been cleared. And there was one house being framed at that point in this scraped earth. And so I took a picture of that subdivision coming up.
Yeah.
And I took a picture of a green pasture with the cows on it over on Rico Road. And I just had those two panoramic views on the front of the postcard with the title, "Who Do You Want as Your Neighbor?"
Oh.
And any public meetings down here had been held in the old gym to what had been an elementary school and had been decommissioned. It was kind of a community center. And it always held the 20, 30 people that showed up. Well, that night, on a January night, so many people showed up that they couldn't get in. And we opened all the windows and people were leaning into the windows. And it was just jam-packed. So we had really touched a nerve with the community and empowered a community to show up and enter the discussion.
Yeah.
And this was not suggesting there was any solution, just saying that we wanted to be different than the rest of the metro Atlanta, where the landowners had sat by until it was too late to do anything about it. That meeting then proceeded on to other meetings to where primarily the purpose was to educate them on the threat of what could happen and the various options that might be out there that as a community we could choose. One of my absolute favorite that I so wished we'd had cell phones with cameras or videos at the time as I look back was we'd moved to the community room in Palmetto, one of the churches. And for this particular meeting I'm thinking about, we had 14 round tables and ECOS had base maps for each of the tables, exact maps. And now we had been having these educational meetings. And so we told everyone that we were going to spend 45 minutes now deciding on what they wanted to save, whether it was historic structures, view sheds, stream buffers. We wanted to identify with the markers everything that everyone felt was important to preserve. And they did that in the 45 minutes without a problem. And then we said, all right, now we want to decide how we can develop the area.
Okay.
ECOS did a study to see what Atlanta had been doing, the metro area, that's 17 counties, over the last 2 decades, and determined that if we did no regional planning and simply allowed this area to be rezoned 500 acres, 1,000 acres at a time, as Metro Atlanta had done over the last 2 decades, we would most likely disturb 80% of the land for 30,000 houses.
Okay.
And so we to the community said it's our responsibility now in the greater Metro Atlanta, but we have pro-development people here. So where are we going to put the 30,000 houses? And then they did these little clear templates that showed 4 houses to an acre, 10 houses to an acre. It was various
density options
that we had. But the goal is they had numbers at the bottom of each of them. You had to have put this puzzle together, so that added up to 30,000.
30,000.
Squeeze it in amongst everything you had just decided you wanted to save. So we turned an entire community into planners to where they could understand the issues and the challenges of this.
Yes.
Now that 45-minute exercise took 2 hours and no one was ready to leave, but we called an end to it. And then the next meeting, they brought 3 maps back and they said they had distilled 14 into 3 general themes.
Okay.
And then everyone went around and voted and discussed. And that's how we came up with a map that the community said they wanted. For the large landowners, after we had brought some consensus that we could do something, we brought Phil Tabb in to have a charrette with the large landowners.
Okay.
Now,
so
again, for this 2-day charrette, we brought in the Urban Land Institute, the Nature Conservancy, the Georgia Conservancy. So we had the preservation and the development crowd at this meeting too. And this group came together with a plan that we thought made sense. to where we could put all the development in 30% of the land and preserve the rest. When we brought the 500 landowners together in the smaller, we did not show them the map from the large landowners.
So you had
Nor
done
did
that.
we share it with ECOS, who was leading the effort. So the map and the ideas of the large landowners were never shared in the public process meeting because we realized that there would be opposition. No matter what somebody said, the other would not say. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So the 2-day charrette that you did with the large landowners and the preservationists sort of did it, pleased with it possibly, set it on a shelf over here, and then went out to talk to all of the landowners, which included the 500 small, with this planning group, ECOS, or strategic planning group.
That's correct.
ECOS. Do you have pictures of those maps?
I do.
Have?
And so it's fascinating because then there's one more process. Once we had consensus on the small landowners to what they would accept through the public process with the county planning department, I thought, man, we're moving forward. But while we had the planning department with us the whole way, there were many other departments. And so this now had to go to the Fulton County departments to approve.
So
the biggest issue was public works, for example.
I was going to say, I want to stop you there and say, like, okay, so you're talking about Fulton County
as a whole.
And so you've got the planning department.
But that's one department of about 8.
Okay, that's what I want to know because I don't know anything about planning departments.
So just imagine your planners talk about what's going to happen and how it's going to happen.
Right.
Then you have all the people that deal with every day. And so so your public works deal with your sewers, your roads.
Yep. Okay.
And they have to approve then anything that the planning group says, oh, this is okay with us. We think this is good.
Okay. And do they all sort of work in silos?
They all work in silos.
Okay.
And then you have stormwater, which is federally regulated. So there's a lot of pieces that really have to fit together. But for Fulton County to move this forward to the Board of Commissioners, all these departments had to kind of sign off on this land use plan that was being proposed. And
when you go to sign off, this county commissioner that spoke with you is just one of them that has to vote on it? Does the whole county? And so the whole county, all 7 have to vote on this plan, even though it affects this one commissioner's area. Okay. So you've got the planning department on board. And was stormwater the next one you had to go talk to, or what was the sort of process?
Stormwater was more federal, and that really is down the road issue, but it dovetails into public works. But public works really was not in favor.
Why not?
And what we found out that the public did not know at the time is they had actually planned sewer for this entire area at a scale of 1 house per acre. And the recent bonds that had been passed for the expansion of the wastewater treatment plant included servicing this area and some 30,000 new users. And so why our clustering and what working with the legal department at the University of Georgia, we realized that if you ran or allowed this sewer that actually they were proposing at the time we had this advice, we didn't know that it was already planned, you could not block sprawl development.
What?
Because if there's a sewer line, someone can sue to connect to it.
Wait a minute.
And so part of our land use regulation required clustered wastewater treatment centers.
The land use that you guys had set up, that the consensus had come from all the landowners on the 40,000 acres down here, all wanted clustered high density development. But because this public works bond and planned, not even implemented, but planned, they were going to block it?
That's correct.
That's crazy.
Because suddenly they couldn't promise the users because it's clustered, we could have an independent sewer system. In fact, we required it. Because even if we had a land plan, if the sewer line ran down the road, you could sue to connect to it, and then sprawl would happen. So this was the advice from the law department that we should have these clustered developments. And
that was from UGA.
And we were also then working with engineers recommended by John Todd, who was one of the living machine person. So we had all this advice coming in. So that caused several more meetings to really bring a consensus around to have public works stand down.
That's incredible.
That's literally what had to happen. So this was quite a task to get all, though. And now those maps are great maps because you can look at the one map done by the large landowners in isolation, led by Phil Tabb, who did his doctorate on the English village system. And it shows the clustered with 70% preservation. And where the development is scheduled to occur is mostly on those large landowners' land, naturally.
Sure, of course.
Then when you look at the smaller landowners, the map is very similar.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Because they said, well, if there is going to be development, not in my backyard.
Oh, so they pushed it onto the large landowners.
And so they pushed it away from them, which ended up on the large landowner land.
Oh, wow.
And then the public works and transportation and everybody that looked at it wanted to make sure that where large development was going to happen, there was access to South Fulton Parkway, which was proposed. It wasn't even in at this point.
Okay.
But you had to look at some of those infrastructure issues. And so they adjusted it very minorly. And then they released the land use plan for all of South Fulton.
Okay.
So this is from 285 all the way down, including our 40,000 acres.
Okay.
Now, there you have 3 maps with 3 different filters that basically are saying the same thing.
Same thing.
So that, I think, is a good demonstration that if you share all of the issues with a group of people and all the options, many times they'll come around to the same decisions.
Independently.
But when we have fear that one group is going to do something that infringes on my rights, we automatically react without thinking about the options that there are. So I think that's just a great in community conversation as to what you do. Now there's a 4th map that I'm going to have printed on a board because it shows. This map was 2002. I have a map from 2007. When suddenly the development fever had hit South Fulton.
Right.
So you realize we had laid down the land use plan just ahead of the threat. And you can see the very line of our 40,000 acres.
You can see it driving down South Fulton Parkway.
You can see it now, but from the air, from what was approved, it is just as obvious as anything. And so you can really see that these land plans make a huge difference. We show it's not a sacrifice of less housing for preservation. In fact, we can actually accommodate 20% more housing. And infrastructure is 40% to install and to maintain versus the old sprawl division.
So 40% less.
It's 60% less.
60%
it's 40% of the cost.
So 60% less cost. And you just said, how many more houses?
20% more housing.
More houses.
And it's mixed use we're looking at. So you're not driving out to the services.
Right,
it's
so
not a bedroom community.
It's
actually. Now, this was all 2002. Now, you project forward here to 2020. We're talking about autonomous shared vehicles.
Right.
We are looking at where the market of the millennials and the baby boomers are all going to walkable communities, maybe for different reasons, but we're all wanting walkable communities, which means you have to have cluster development for those walkable communities. And so what we set out with our land plan is clearly the pattern of development for the future to address market and transportation systems that are emerging.
So all of that took 2 years to do.
That's right. And that's just land use.
And that's just land use. And I'm like, I might need another episode. So that's just land use. Now, so you got it passed through the commissioner.
That's right.
What was the percentage? I mean, you promised him less than 30% opposition. What was the final number?
By the time we took it to the commission, we had 80% of the landowners paying dues into the organization.
Okay.
And the 20% who didn't join us also didn't oppose us.
That's good.
I call them the front porch critics because they never came out to educate themselves, never came out to oppose us. But man, if you find them on their front porch, they'll tell you everything that's wrong with it.
Sure. So the commission was happy because he didn't have them show up with the baseball caps.
There was not one word of opposition, and so it passed unanimously with one reading. And there were several editorials on it. It was a great example of public engagement.
That's great. So now, once that happened, though, I do recall that something had to go to the Georgia Assembly. Is that the same?
Well, we realized we had a great pattern, but now it was the task of how were we going to do it.
Okay.
And we realized that one of the tools we were missing was transfer development rights.
Okay.
Because if we were going to level the playing field on value and moving density from one area to another, the best way to do that was through transfer development rights.
Can I stop you right there and have you explain transfer development rights?
So it is the transfer of the right to develop one piece of property to another.
Okay.
Growing up in Colorado, I was very accustomed to mineral rights, water rights, air rights. And so the concept of development rights was just another right that you would have that had value. In Georgia, in the South, in property rights states, it's, as one man said, what do you mean? I either own the land or I don't. What are you talking about?
Right, sure, makes sense.
And so this is a whole new concept that we could sever some value and you still owned your dirt. But that's what it is. You will no longer have the right to develop that land, and it's part of the title that any development is restricted from that land. So
if I have 100 acres, I get to keep my 100 acres, but I have sold someone.
So you choose. So if you have a house on that 100 acres, you only have 99 development rights to sell.
Okay.
It's an assumed base of 1 unit to an acre.
Okay.
Now, let's say you have 3 kids and you hope they'll come and build a home place. So you could do a master plan that shows where those 3 additional housing sites might be.
Okay.
So then you have 96 development rights to sell.
Okay.
And you can sell those.
Okay.
The 2 best examples in the country then, and I believe now, was Montgomery County, Maryland, and Boulder County, Colorado. Now, they each do it differently. And in both cases, the local government sets the value.
Oh.
We decided that we would allow free market to establish the value.
Sure.
And that's what we've done.
That's great.
We find that it's generally 50% of what the going rate on the land is. So if you own that 100 acres, you can sell the 96 development rights for 50% of what the land value is.
Okay.
But you keep your land. You continue paying taxes on your land. But the taxes have been reduced because now they have no future value for development.
Oh, that's a benefit.
Now,
okay.
That is something that really forces a lot of farmers or land lovers off their property when they're in the path of development.
Yep.
Because even if they hold on to it, the taxes become so high that they can no longer do them. So this took care of that issue. Many times you see these properties changing hands when there's a death. And the next generation is divided. They may not love the land, or someone lives in the city. This allows for 50% of the value to go to those the inheritance, to where you can cash out. So if it's divided, let's say, between two siblings, the one wants the money and one wants the land, this allows that to happen without them having to sell it. So it just has a lot of advantages.
And then my 96 acres that are still, they're still quote unquote my land. I have my cows on it. I can do a farm on it. I can do anything I want on it, but it's permanently preserved. Is that?
It's permanently preserved from housing.
From housing, okay.
So it does it now. Any farm use can happen. You can put a new barn on it.
Okay.
You can have an equestrian center.
Oh, okay.
You can have anything that's zoned in agricultural areas. So you can have a country inn.
Oh, interesting.
You can have a brewery. You could do any of the
So there's still a financial benefit, even past the selling and the lower taxes. It's not as if that land lies dormant just to grow,
That's right. Now, you can't put in industry in it.
Sure.
You can't asphalt it over for parking or any of those things.
Right.
It's one of the great tools that's really not understood on a big level. There is no way in America that the preservation groups can raise the money to stay ahead of the development community.
Yeah.
And the brilliance of this type program is it links development with preservation.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to kick in until there is a development threat. But to develop, you have to buy into the transfer development right program. So they're absolutely hand in hand.
Linked, yeah.
And we did a study back then and determined that for every dollar raised compared to a preservation program and a TDR program, we could save 7 times the land for the same dollars.
So go ahead and repeat that. 7?
We determined that if you take the same dollar invested in a preservation plan or a TDR plan, you can save 7 times the land through the TDR plan.
Well, and I can think about growing up in California, a ton of places, especially Orange County, where I grew up in Pasadena area, but we would drive down to the beach and it just, development came from the sand all the way up to the highways over those sort of 20 to 30 years that we would go down and visit my grandparents. And they were ranches and they could have done the same thing. And they just were these stamped out, mostly gated communities with nothing in them except houses and maybe a clubhouse. So
it's a plague across America and in many other countries as well. And as we know now, looking back, the research is coming out. Not only is it an environmental plague, it is a health plague. And today we are more depressed and sicker than we've ever been. And a lot of it comes back to the way we've been building places for people to live.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So Steve, this is great. We are actually out of time. So I think for our next episode, I want to hear how you got the TDRs sort of through the Georgia legislature and sort of who was a part of that. And then I think, you've sort of mentioned you had the county, the control you had, because of the 70-30, you had control on a county level. But tell me how then you went to get local.
So we'll get into all those things. And there's several more layers, and hopefully we can get that in the next episode.
Yes.
So I think what you're referring to is how do we become a city?
Yes. Well, great. I look forward to hearing about that on our next episode.
Good. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts. For more details, visit our website, serenbestories.com.